Hello GCSE students, this is the last video on the beginning of A Christmas Carol based on the reading that I did. Up into this section here at the bottom where it says Bah and Humbug. So I'm not going to read it again for the reasons that I've said before, that it's been read already, but let's get cracking really. We're told at the top of the page that Scrooge likes to edge his way along the crowded paths of life. And if he's on the edges, then he's on the margins, and that he has self-marginalised. He has othered himself. Scrooge is an outsider. That's what that's telling us, I feel. Then the next paragraph. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. Now what's significant here is that Dickens has used this well-worn fairy tale trope, this well-worn fairy tale line, a trope, a recurring device, a recurring feature, to tell us that, well, maybe the text is a fairy tale in some way, and what do fairy tales do? They teach us a message or a moral. And we're going to be taught a message and a moral through the character, through the construct of Scrooge as well. But it's also to make it seem somewhat trivial. We also know from a fairy tale, stories that begin once upon a time usually have a happy ending. So there are all these kinds of clues that Dickens is giving us on the way. We're told that old Scrooge, he is our villain, old Scrooge, he's busy in his counting house. And Dickens then goes on to use the extended metaphor of the weather. So if ever you've seen a film version of this, you'll know that nearly all of them, whether it's the Jim Carrey one, the George C. Scott one, the one starring Patrick Stewart, there are almost too many versions of the film to count, but they tend to all have one defining feature at the beginning, which is it's pretty cold looking, it's snowy, it's bleak, and perhaps the most significant of those features is that it's foggy, because fog prevents us from being able to see clearly, and Scrooge is not able to see clearly either. He cannot see how the way that he lives his life causes significant problems. It causes him to be shut off, isolated, alone. And it's the ability to see that will bring about Scrooge's rapid changing character. As he changes, the weather will change. So it's a pretty straightforward extended metaphor, but it's a significant one nonetheless. So it was cold, bleak, biting weather, and he could hear the people outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts. You can hear me beating my hand, stamping my feet, because you do that to keep warm. There, I'm rubbing my hands. So it's cold outside is what we're being told. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. Now, on its own, that's not a hugely significant point that the clocks are only turning 3, but time is a pretty important concept throughout the text. Scrooge has been wasting his time on life, and his time is running out. And the ghosts of Marley, the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, the ghost of Christmas yet to come, they are here to warn him that he must use the time he has wisely. It's also true to say that when the ghosts are there, when they are visiting Scrooge and he is journeying with them, time kind of goes out the window. Time becomes irrelevant. So time significant, but in this instance it's just that it's gone 3 o'clock. But it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day. Oh look, it's dark outside. So we have maybe some pathetic fallacy there, but it's just more about the imagery of daylight. So it's foggy, Scrooge cannot see. It's dark, Scrooge cannot see. And it causes candles to be lit. So candles were flaring in the windows of the neighbouring offices like ruddy smears. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and was so dense, it was so thick, this fog, that although the Yeah, the courtyard was the narrowest. The houses opposite were mere phantoms. You could barely see them through the thickness of the fog. So, in the previous video, I suggested that Scrooge was something of a caricature, but we can also see how the environment around him is almost something of a caricature. If we accept that it's almost being personified, it's really rather exaggerated. So we're certainly safe to say that there's hyperbole, but we could also maybe go a bit further as well. Something of a caricature. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by. So the suggestion here is that nature is struggling too. Then we move on to Scrooge's physical space, where he operates. The door of Scrooge's counting house was open that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. What we have here is an image of mindless drudgery. Scrooge does not trust his clerk, his employee. We're told of Scrooge's business, most specifically here, it's a counting house, so he collects monies. But his clerk operates in a cell. We associate cells with prisons, and therefore that his clerk is somewhat imprisoned. And this idea of drudgery, mindless, boring work, drudgery, is reinforced through the task that the clerk is carrying out, copying letters. Then we're told about the fire. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like one coal. Now, in the winter time, some of you might have had a fire going in your house. And the chances are that you used some sticks and some bits of newspaper and whatever old sort of stuff that was dry lying around went into the fire. If you had coal, you probably put about, I don't know, 10 coals, because that would get a nice good fire going and make you feel warm. One coal ain't going to do so much. So the clerk has a very small fire, just one coal, but he couldn't replenish it. He couldn't add more to it. Why? Because Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and as soon as the clerk came in with a shovel to collect more coal, then the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. So if the clerk, who we'll come to know as Bob Cratchit, comes in to ask for more coal, then we know that Scrooge will fire him, effectively. The simplest way to put it. There'll be no job for him. Now, this is written in 1843, this text. And in 1843, the new poor laws were in full vigour, as Scrooge puts it later in the text. The poor laws of 1834 brought about the creation of two things. One, the workhouse. Two, the debtor's prison. The workhouse is where one would have gone to voluntarily put yourself in the care of the state. Now, if ever you're not sure, all you have to do is use the facilities available to you, as I'm doing here. And I'm deliberately including me searching on the video just to show you. Look, type in Victorian workhouse and see the images that you get coming up. These images typically here, look, lots and lots of people in incredibly narrow, confined spaces doing menial tasks. So these people are working, and they are working incredibly long hours, maybe 14 hours a day. And what do they get out of it? They get a roof above their heads. So I said previously that people are going here voluntarily. They're going there to put themselves in the care of the state so that they get provided with a roof over their heads and basic, incredibly basic rations. The second option, the debtor's prison, was involuntary. You didn't go there because you chose to. You went there because you failed to pay back some money to maybe somebody like Scrooge, a man with a counting house. And this is significant because Dickens's own life was shaped by some of these problems. So at the age of 11 or 12, Dickens became the so-called man of his own household when his father was sent to debtor's prison for failing to pay back some monies down the road. So as a consequence, the young Charles Dickens had to give up school. He had to go into the world of work and earn some money. So the new poor laws that I was referring to are significant because for somebody like Bob Cratchit, it's better to be in paid work, even with a cold, stingy miser for a boss like Scrooge. It's better to have some work than to have nothing and to risk being sent to the debtor's prison or having to go cap in hand to the Victorian workhouse. Bob Cratchit we will come to see is stuck between the proverbial rock and a hard place. Having a boss like Scrooge is a rock. It's not very pleasant, but the hard place is the prison, is the workhouse, and therefore Bob Cratchit the clerk will stay. He will carry on. So it says, wherefore, which is why, the clerk put on his white comforter, so he put on another layer, and tried to warm himself by a candle. I don't know if you've ever tried it. I haven't. Can't imagine that it would work. And we're told there that he failed, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. So to imagine that you're warm by a candle requires strong mental power, strong imagination. You need to believe in it. And the last part of this particular video is the introduction of a new voice. And the new voice is characterised as cheerful. A Merry Christmas, Uncle. God save you. Oh, amidst all this gloom, amidst all the misery of Scrooge's counting house and the way that he treats his workers and the way that he's an outsider in society, look, we can see that it's not everywhere. There are reasons for optimism, and the cheerful voice will be that of Fred. Fred, who is Scrooge's nephew. A Merry Christmas, Uncle. God save you. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first clue, the first intimation, the first clue he had of his approach. So in comparison to Scrooge, Fred here moves so quickly. He's full of joy, he's full of lightness and life. And you may remember from the previous video that we saw that Scrooge was stiff. And I said that Scrooge's movements and his physical appearance were representative of his emotional and mental state. So his mental harshness was displayed in his physical appearance. Fred, an altogether different character, cheerful voice, quick movements, message of Christmas spirit. He's the antithesis, the very opposite of Scrooge at the beginning of the text. And I finished with this line here about Bah and Humbug, partly because I just like to moan about it, really. My father-in-law has I think somebody bought him a mug or something like that. I've certainly seen them in the shops as well, where at Christmas time somebody buys you a mug and it says Bah Humbug, or you are a Bah Humbug. It drives me a bit nuts, really, because you can't be a Bah Humbug. There is no such thing as a bah humbug. It's been kind of misappropriated, misused throughout the years. There is no such thing as a bah humbug, because what does it actually mean? Well, Fred has come in and said, "Merry Christmas, God save you," and Scrooge has gone, "Bah," as if, nonsense. And then humbug. So bah is a dismissive sound. Bah, psh. And humbug is because he thinks Christmas is a humbug. So a person cannot be a bah humbug, at least not in the sense that Dickens meant it. Maybe if we accept that language changes over time, then maybe you can. But Dickens is saying bah. Dickens is having Scrooge say bah as a sort of sound of dismissal, and then humbug as a word which means nonsense. And that's it for this particular video, which explains the first section of reading that was done. I will read more. I will not read every single section of the text, but I'll read more, and then we'll go through it a bit like this to ensure that while schools are closed, you can proceed through the text with a guide that pushes you in the right direction.